The word neoliberalism has come to be a general term of abuse in many circles. Out of the mouths of Latin American populists like Argentina's Cristina Fernandez or Mexico's AMLO, it is simply a synonym for capitalism, which they demonize as the root of inequality and exploitation. A more sensible definition is the more restricted one I used in chapters 2 and 3 of my last book, Liberalism and Its Discontents, where it refers to a specific interpretation of market economics associated with economists like Milton Friedman and the Chicago School. They articulated a broad critique of state intervention in markets on economic efficiency. This led to a policy agenda carried out by politicians like Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher that pushed for a series of reforms, including reduction of trade barriers and subsidies, stability of money supply, fiscal balance, deregulation, privatization, and the like, the famous Washington Consensus. Liberalism in the latter sense has been criticized extensively not just by the progressive left, but by mainstream economists like Joseph Stiglitz and Danny Roderick, and at this point is a spent force politically. But this means that it's a good point to look at the Washington Consensus and ask whether we need to reconsider this total rejection and judge whether parts of it were actually quite sound. At the top of the neoliberal agenda were issues like fiscal balance and a stable money supply. This was a prolonged period, or there was a prolonged period from the late 1980s up until a couple of years ago, when inflation looked like it had been permanently tamed and that governments could risk running larger deficits. It turned out that this so-called Great Moderation was a product of a one-off circumstance, the addition of several 100 million new workers from China and a handful of other developing countries to the global labor market. This held down wages and prices across the board and led to massive shifts of low-skilled labor from rich countries to emerging ones. In addition, the world saw the shift to a digital economy whose innovations were finally showing up in productivity numbers. This period is now over, and we are back in the pre-1980s world of budget deficits and high inflation. It's important to remember what drove the Washington Consensus. It was a response to the economic crises of the 1970s and 80s, when suddenly rising oil prices triggered not just inflation, but in several cases hyperinflation. This then led to balance of payments crises, massive devaluations, recessions, and ultimately a series of sovereign defaults across Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa. Many developing countries lost at least a decade's worth of economic growth. I remember visiting Brazil and Argentina in the early 1990s. Inflation in Brazil was then running at around 20% per month, which I thought was extraordinary until I got to Buenos Aires. There I was told that Brazil had not yet experienced real hyperinflation, which had reached some 20,000% on an annual basis in Argentina shortly before my visit. Such was the nature of life before neoliberalism. The moderation of inflation in subsequent years was not just the product of China's entry into the global system, but of the acceptance of the monetary component of the Washington Consensus. Newly independent central banks were made inflation targeting and monetary stability their top priority, and the world benefited. Countries that haven't accepted this part of the consensus, like Turkey and present-day Argentina, continue to suffer from debilitating rates of inflation. And the developed world that had forgotten the lessons of this period are experiencing rates of inflation not seen since the 1980s. Now that we are living in an inflationary world, the logic of at least that part of the Washington Consensus may start to make more sense. Thank you for listening. If you want to see the Frankly Fukuyama blog post on which this video is based, please go to the link at the bottom of the screen.